Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Act Up. I'm Nola Mims, and today we're going to talk about what addiction is not. More specifically, I want to lay to rest some common misconceptions about addiction. And today we're going to discuss what I like to call the addiction narrative, its characters, and what they have to gain. The addiction narrative is the idea that drugs are the sole problem. But there are many actors behind the scenes who benefit from this narrative. They benefit from our pointed attention and disgust towards drugs and their users. So today, I invite you to consider, what if drugs are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of bettering our social welfare and public health? Oftentimes, we like to paint substance users with a broad brush. By subscribing to the addiction narrative, we're forced to understand all substance use as disordered behavior. I guess that's for a different debate. But speaking from a psychological perspective, addiction in many ways is the exception to the rule instead of the rule itself. Dr. Carl Hart, a neuroscientist and professor of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University, shares with us that only 10 to 20% of users fall into our DSM definition of substance use disorder. If you remember in our last video, I went over the criteria necessary for a diagnosis of addict, or a patient with substance use disorder. When we think of an addict in our head, or even just in media portrayal, attributes like violent, crazy, stupid, criminal, and other reductive things may come to mind. But research would suggest 80 to 90% of all substance users function normally in their work, school, and family settings. In 2017 alone, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health reported almost 20 million people suffered with a substance use disorder. That's not accounting for people who are homeless, active duty military personnel, incarcerated in mental institutions, nursing homes, and long-term care facilities. But if 20 million people on average face addiction each year, that would suggest 100 million to 200 million US residents fall into the substance use category I like to call grown-ass adults. By the way, our population is around 330 million. But I'm not suggesting those who struggle with substance use disorder are not adults. Quite the contrary. These folks are often those who are called on to be grown well before their time. What I am saying is that we're trying to talk about and make decisions for 200 million people based on the needs of 20 million. And my issue is that we're not even doing right by those 20 million. The addiction industry brings in $35 billion a year on treatment alone, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. This is in conflict with the fact that addiction rates stay fairly stable year to year. So when we are consuming or discussing information about drugs, we must be aware of the different actors at play and what they have to gain in the messages we receive. More specifically, politicians, the prison industrial complex, the rural towns that depend on their revenue, the medical, research, and media institutions, they all stand to gain literal capital from the addiction narrative. The rest of this video will go on to what they have to gain specifically. I'll preface by saying this is not an exhaustive list. This is a starting place, as we can no longer afford to trust the drug information being peddled to us. But the first and probably most obvious actor is the politician. The tough on crime campaign promises and regurgitated family values because the kids, what about the kids? Well, 16 to 21% of teens have and will continue to try drugs at least once in their lifetime. And when I say have and will continue, I mean this will continue to happen generation after generation, year after year. Not to say that kids will try it and continue the drug. That's not the same thing. Drug experimentation is a normal behavior for teens. The issue is with younger children consuming drugs and teens consuming drugs no longer as a means of experimentation, but as a coping tool. If politicians were serious about protecting our youth from the evils of drugs, we wouldn't be criminalizing them or their families and communities. As I hinted in our last video, purpose in life, coping skills, and also cognitive skills are risk factors specific to youth substance abuse. I don't know about you, but I've never heard Reagan or Nixon or any other old white men talk about policy geared towards helping kids develop coping skills or purpose in life. We send them off into the same world we so desperately try to escape, assuming just say no is enough to quell a curious mind. Not disconnected from politics, all parties involved in the prison industrial complex benefit from the addiction narrative. Where this becomes a bigger issue is where it ties back into the political. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, almost 50% of prisoners are in jail for non-violent drug offenses. And you might think, okay, well, isn't that how it's always been? Not really. Remember those old white guys I mentioned before, Reagan and Nixon? Their presidential policies acted as matches to the dumpster fire we now recognize as mass incarceration. By 1971, Nixon had declared an all-out war on drugs, and from that point forward, incarceration rates began to creep upward. John Ehrlichman, another old white man, and Nixon's aide in domestic affairs, was quoted saying, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." I can't believe I just did that. Eventually, Reagan came in with the alley-oop, passing the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. By the end of '86, incarceration rates were record-breaking and would remain so well into the 2000s. By 2005, incarceration rates were 4 times that of 1970, and many struggling rural towns found financial relief in the growing industry. As farming and manufacturing have become less viable sources of income for these communities, large for-profit prisons have jumped on the high rates of unemployment. For every 100 people newly incarcerated, there are 35 jobs created. There were 2.19 million people incarcerated in 2019. So somewhere around 770,000 jobs are sustained by this mass incarceration. Meaning if we were to decriminalize all drugs and expunge all non-violent drug offenses, tomorrow we'd lose 400,000 jobs. This would disproportionately affect rural communities or prison towns that rely on the revenue to stay afloat. In states like Texas, California, Florida, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, around 30% of jobs come from the employment of correctional officers. The next entity I'll be discussing is the medical industry. $42 billion was spent on rehab facilities this year. If you look at opioids specifically, pharmaceutical companies stand to profit quite a bit. Alicia Taylor, a spokesperson for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Public Health and Human Services, said in an email the high prices of naloxone have limited the number of doses that the local government and its partner organizations can purchase and distribute. And that, she said, has hurt our ability to treat overdoses and save lives. The original author, who sourced this quote, also mentions, "These companies meet their bottom dollar regardless, but only users with money can afford second chances at life and possibly sobriety." Insys Therapeutics derived nearly all of its revenue from fentanyl in recent years. They are now under investigation by multiple state and federal agencies and have been scrutinized by media organizations large and small for allegedly enticing doctors to widely prescribe the drug for minor ailments such as back pain. The pharmaceutical company had also been fast-tracked by the Food and Drug Administration to develop its own overdose-combating naloxone spray. This is just one of the examples of how the government isn't protecting its citizens from the drug war they started. Lastly, I'll touch on research institutions, which contribute to the standards of the medical institution. In this case, money is provided to the labs that do research the government wants to see done. Oftentimes, that is research that focuses on the risk of drugs. And you might think to yourself, what's wrong with being cautious? One word, LaGuardia. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, then let me tell you about another old white man named Harry Anslinger. From 1930 to 1962, he was the drug czar, more formally known as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. During this time, he commissioned research on the evils of marijuana. When the report came back with contrary results, he said, "Fuck it," and made up lies. I will now recite a few choice quotes from Harry's hit single, Reefer Madness. "Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing results from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and other kinds. You smoke a joint, and you're likely to kill your brother. Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effects on the degenerate races. No one knows when he places a marijuana cigarette to his lips whether he'll become a joyous reveler in a musical heaven, a mad incident, a calm philosopher, or a murderer. If the hideous monster Frankenstein came face to face with marijuana, he would drop dead of fright. Some people will fly into a delirious rage and they are temporarily irresponsible and may commit violent crimes. Other people will laugh uncontrollably. It's impossible to say what the effects will be on any individual. Marijuana leads to pacifism and communist brainwashing. It is dangerous to the mind and body, and particularly dangerous to the criminal type because it releases all of the inhibitions. The uses of cannabis, whether smoked or ingested in its various forms, undoubtedly give rise to a form of addiction, which has serious social consequences: abandonment of work, propensity to theft and crime, and disappearance of reproductive power. You may be thinking to yourself, "Good thing this lunatic is dead. Am I right?" No? Just me? Joking. But, in all seriousness, although the censorship has become less blatant, research institutions are incentivized to cuddle up to big government. Even just looking at the NIDA, this organization is responsible for funding 90% of all US drug research. This funding goes almost exclusively to drug harm research and perpetuating the addiction narrative. Without blessing from the government, labs are not immune to the drug war. To make matters worse, the director of the NIDA, Dr. Nora Volwalk, is characterized as a tyrannical leader. So again, even when we're looking to the research, we have to bring a critical lens. And last, but certainly not least, we have the media. It's no surprise to us that the media profits from our sadness, outrage, outfighting, infighting, and a bunch of other emotions and or behaviors that will ultimately lead to our demise as a society. But with that being said, drug reports and stories are no exception. Someone is literally collecting a check as we watch the rising death toll of this opioid epidemic. We genuinely cannot rely on the information that we're receiving. Overdose deaths reported by the media are a surefire way to draw attention, but no one knows where that data really comes from. Until now. Some of you are more well versed with the logistics of death and may know that medical examiners and coroners are our first line of defense in this addiction narrative. As long as we believe drugs are the problem, autopsies seem like the logical solution to finding an answer, except they're not. First and foremost, only 23% of the population is currently being served by a medical examiner that is accredited by NAME, a professional organization of physician medical examiners. This doesn't have to be a problem, but what is the lack of investigation consistency across the country, paired with death certificate uniformity. We could also think of this as the cause of death being chalked up to multi-drug intoxication or drug abuse. Many coroners, especially in less financed towns, lack the proper training and or death certificate phraseology to interpret a toxicology report. When we take this into account, it's quite difficult to calculate the standard margin of error for these reports en masse. So when we see sudden spikes in death attributed to opioids, we should be asking questions like, was a toxicology report done? Does the death investigator have the proper training to analyze and interpret the results? How about the knowledge to run further testing for things such as chemical derivatives, impurities, and drug analogs like fentanyl? Were there any other drugs in the person's system, or fatally dangerous drug combinations, or even how was the drug administered? Some medical examiners will go off the appearance of evidence alone to claim drug overdose as the cause of death. This is extremely important with drugs like MDMA, where someone is more likely to die from overexertion or dehydration than the chemical itself, at least in its pure form. The next time you read about a drug-related death or incident, try to do a little digging to see what's under the surface. I spend so much time talking about death investigations because those reports are often the main fodder of drug news. The last few things I'll tease out about the media have more to do with systemic structures than drugs, but they're still very important in understanding the winners and losers of the drug war. If you've lived through the crack epidemic, you're probably familiar with images of black and brown folks being broadcasted on the nightly news either as criminals or dope fiends. Along with that came super predators, crack babies, and other dehumanizing language. Since the war on drugs was first documented, it was obvious that the media wanted to focus on low-income black and brown urban neighborhoods. Even though people of all colors and SES background consumed crack, black people soon became the face of this epidemic. This neatly ties back to our politicians and mass incarceration. In order to stay in good favor with their base, politicians will often use fear tactics or something to make their constituents scared in order to be a hero of sorts. As we heard from the Nixon admin, the criminal parade of blacks only helped to get civilians in on the war. We were repeatedly told, if you see something, say something, and other slogans to get everyone behind the illusion of a drug-free society. Even when we look at the news today, we see black and brown substance users are treated as criminals, while white users are treated like victims with a need for medical treatment. Race and class are two huge factors in the treatment of drug use. The media uses them to tell the addiction narrative in a way that makes drugs the root of our problems. This allows us to demonize drugs as opposed to the systemic oppression. The media has and always will continue to hide evidence of racism and classism. So we have to dig deeper. So please, meet me back here for our next video on occupational and recreational substance use. This video is the last segment of a two-part video. If you missed the first one, you can go ahead and click here to watch that, or maybe it's here. I don't know, I'm new here. The first of which, that video talked about what addiction is. Until then, I'm Nola Mims. Thank you for joining in, and I'll see you next time.